With Unit 7, we are moving our study of the Bible into the New Testament. So here we go. To recap, there are 73 books total in the Bible. 46 of them are in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. And remember we talked about there are 4 different categories of books in the Hebrew Scriptures. In Unit 1, we took some bookmarks and actually looked at some Bibles and saw how those sections were portioned out. So the Pentateuch, those first 5 books of the Bible, the historical book, the wisdom books, and the prophetic books. So those 46 books are divided up into 4 categories. And the events that are written in the Old Testament happened over about 2,000 years, and the writing and the editing of those things took about 1,000 years. So let's compare those 46 books, 2,000 years of events, 1,000 years of editing and writing. Let's compare that to what the New Testament looks like. So if there are 46 books in the Bible, or in the Old Testament in the Bible, and there are 73 books total in the Bible, that leaves 27 books in the New Testament. And just like the Old Testament, the New Testament has 4 categories of books. But if you notice, most of those categories have far fewer books, and that's just a result of the numbers. 46 books in the Old Testament versus 27 in the New. So Gospels, there are 4 Gospels, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The book Acts of the Apostles, which is the story of the early church. So now we're getting into books that mention Jesus by name. Remember, we as Christians believe that the Old Testament does talk about Jesus, just doesn't talk about Jesus by name. The Gospels are stories of what Jesus actually said and did. Acts of the Apostles is the story of the early church. So those books will reference Jesus by name. Letters will also reference Jesus by name. And notice that some of these letters are named after places, and some of them are named after people. And we learned back in Unit 1 that if it's the name of a place, we say it's the letter to the Romans, the Corinthians, the Ephesians, the Colossians. And if it's the name of a person, it could be a letter to. So a letter to Timothy, a letter to Titus, a letter to Philemon. But then we also have some letters that were written by people. So the letters of James, of Peter, of John, of Jude. And then the 4th category is the book of Revelation. And now you might be looking at those categories of Acts and Revelation and going, well, it doesn't seem like there's, where are the books that belong in this category? 1 book, 1 category. So that book is a category all unto itself. And Acts of the Apostles, story of the early church, Revelation, and apocalyptic text. And remember, Old Testament events happened over about 2,000 years, and the writing took about 1,000 years. The New Testament's quite a bit shorter in both of those aspects. The New Testament covers events that happen over about 125 years, so starting with when Jesus was born and going to the early church about 100 years later. So you've got 125 years worth of events versus 2,000 years of events, and a writing period of about 75 years versus 1,000 years in the Old Testament. Doesn't mean that one of these is better than the other, just means there's a significant difference. So the next 2 slides will kind of give you some sense of the history here. And I'm not going to ask you to memorize these different years, but I just want you to understand where Jesus and where the early church kind of fit into this timeline. So Solomon's temple got destroyed at 587 BC at the beginning of the Babylonian exile. We've talked about how Nehemiah helped the people to rebuild and rededicate the temple when the Babylonian exile was over. Jewish history over the next 100 years, it's pretty similar to what we talked about in the historical books, where the people aren't always kind of living up to their end of the bargain. So in 164, the temple is purified and rededicated. But in about 54 BC, the Romans loot the temple, and so the temple's in not great shape. In the year 30 BC, a guy named Herod the Great, whose name might sound kind of familiar to you, begins construction on the final temple. And we say the temple was finally destroyed during a Jewish war against Rome. It means the temple has not been rebuilt since it was destroyed in that war during the years 66 to 70. And like we've seen earlier in class, there are some holy sites for other religions that are on that Temple Mount. So, it's not just as easy as let's rebuild the temple in this blank space. And synagogues were also very common at this time. So, if we know that Jesus was born shortly before the year 0, dies around the year 30 AD or CE, kind of stop and think to yourself for a minute, where would Jesus fit in this timeline? Was there a temple when Jesus was living? The answer to that would be yes. So if we see, Herod begins construction of the final temple before Jesus was born. Temple doesn't get destroyed until after Jesus died. So there was a temple in Jerusalem when Jesus was living, and we'll see that mentioned in a lot of the stories about Jesus. So we've talked about a lot of different kind of world history empires in this class. We've talked about the Israelites being very powerful. We've talked about the Assyrians who came after them, then the Babylonians. We've talked about King Cyrus and the Persians. Well, after the Persians aren't so powerful anymore, the Romans start to rule in this area. After about 63 BC, so about 60 years before Jesus is born. And Judea becomes a province. So pretty much the size of ancient Judah, so that country that David very first came from. And it was ruled by prefects. Pontius Pilate was the prefect in that area, starting in the year 26. So he's another figure that shows up in Jesus' story, and we know from other historical records that yes, Pontius Pilate was in that area at that time. Lots of heavy taxation and social unrest, and kind of farmers being forced off their land. So the Roman Empire was very big, very powerful, but not everything was running perfectly. And there were lots of Jews at the time that were just Jews and just interested in being Jews, worshiping at the temple, praying in their synagogues. But then there were also some specific groups of Jews that play a role in the stories of Jesus. The Pharisees and the Sadducees show up in Jesus' story quite a bit. The Sadducees are the priestly class, so they're connected with the management and the running of the temple, sacrifices at the temple. They were connected with the Romans, and they had some disagreements with the Pharisees, who were the scribes, who they disagreed about theological things. So, for instance, the Pharisees thought that there was a life after death, and the Sadducees did not. They disagreed about that. Both of them agreed that keeping the law, the Torah, was incredibly important, but the Pharisees had constructed an entirely additional set of rules to make sure that they were following the original rules correctly. So, for example, if, the rule in Torah was, no high heels, the Pharisees would talk about it and say, okay, well, what heel counts as a high heel? And okay, let's make sure heels under 2 inches. Right, good. To make extra sure they were following that original law correctly. Because following the law means you get to show God how much you love God. So the Pharisees and the Sadducees disagreed about how exactly to follow the law. Now the Essenes thought the Pharisees and the Sadducees were both corrupt, and so they were more of a monastic community. They went to live in caves near the Dead Sea and, kind of await the end of days. And the Zealots were people who tried to overthrow the Roman government by force. So if you think about it, the Romans didn't really care about the disagreements between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They didn't really care that the Essenes went off to live in caves. They did have a problem with the Zealots trying to overthrow their government. And so we'll see in the gospel stories that the Pharisees and the Sadducees, when they disagree with Jesus, they try to get Jesus pegged as a revolutionary, as a zealot. And that's what gets him in trouble with the Romans. Not his preaching, not his religious beliefs. And in class we'll look at those stories a little more.